After 15 years of marriage, I thought I knew every sigh, every silence, every shadow of my husband's heart. But that summer afternoon of 1967, when a yellowed scrap slipped from his old Bible, 7 trembling words tore the ground from beneath my feet. Good morning, dear friends. I'm Margaret Dawson, 78 now, and I've carried this story quietly for most of my life. A story of secrets, sorrow, and the strange strength that comes from forgiveness. If you're here with me, leave a gentle like, subscribe, and let me know where you're watching from. It means more than you know to this old heart. The summer of 1967 had settled gently over our small Ohio town, the kind of summer that pressed warm air against your skin and carried the faint hum of cicadas through open windows. The maples along Main Street were heavy with leaves, their green shadows stretching across cracked sidewalks where children chased one another barefoot. Life in our town moved with a quiet rhythm, church bells marking the hours, neighbors watering their lawns, the sound of baseball games echoing from old radios. Inside our modest 2-story home, painted a soft yellow with white shutters, I moved about with the familiar rhythm of a homemaker's day. James, my husband, was away at the factory where he worked as an accountant. Our son, Michael, 14, had just started working part-time at my father's pharmacy, while our daughter Susan, 12, was in that delicate stage between girlhood and adolescence, spending long hours scribbling in notebooks and sighing at things I couldn't quite understand. That afternoon, determined to banish the dust that clung to summer's heat, I pulled furniture from the walls, shook out rugs, and polished the wooden floor until it gleamed like honey in the fading light. The radio in the corner hummed softly, playing a tune that drifted up from Cleveland, and I hummed along, letting the familiar lyrics steady me. It was in the middle of this simple ritual of cleaning that fate placed its hand on me. As I reached for the high shelf in the living room, my husband's old black leather Bible slipped from my grasp. It struck the polished floor with a muffled thud, scattering fragile pages that fluttered like startled birds. My breath caught, and I bent quickly to gather them, whispering a reflexive prayer under my breath. That's when I saw it. A folded slip of paper, yellowed with age, had slipped free from between the pages of Proverbs. My first thought was to tuck it back without reading. James was a private man, always careful with his things. But something about the way the paper seemed to tremble in my hand, something about the silence that fell over the room as I unfolded it, made me stop. 7 words stared back at me in James's bold, slanted handwriting. Forgive me, Lord. She must never know. For a moment the room tilted, as though the sturdy walls of our Ohio home had shifted on their foundation. I sat there on the shining floor, the note quivering between my fingers, and listened to the steady tick of the mantel clock as if it were counting down to some ending I could not yet name. She. Who was she? Was it me? Or someone else? Another woman? A shadowed secret that had travelled alongside us all these years? I tucked the paper back where I had found it, my hands trembling as though the ink itself burned. The Bible went back on the shelf, its leather cover cool beneath my palm, but nothing inside me was calm. A quiet fissure had opened, and once it began, I could not close it. That night, James returned from work, as he always did. His tie loosened, his hair brushed neatly back, his face carrying the tiredness of numbers and ledgers. He kissed me lightly on the cheek, asked about the children, and took his place at the dinner table as if the world were as steady as ever. Yet I watched him with new eyes. Every gesture, his fork cutting through roast chicken, the way his fingers lingered at his temple, seemed laden with meaning. The days that followed only deepened the unease. James's trips to Cleveland for factory business had grown more frequent over the years, usually no more than a day, sometimes two. He always returned at nightfall, smelling faintly of train smoke and exhaustion. But now I noticed what I had ignored before: the redness in his eyes as if he had been weeping, the silence that wrapped around him thicker than the summer heat, the way he would sit on the porch and stare into the darkness long after the children had gone to bed. I began to wonder about everything: the drawer in his desk that remained locked, the small shortages in the household money he always explained away, the way he shifted when questions touched his past. All these things I had brushed aside now rose like ghosts. I said nothing to the children. Michael, with his proud step into manhood, already carried enough weight. Susan, with her soft glances in the mirror and her restless sighs, needed no shadows added to her world. And so, I carried the paper in my memory alone, a secret folded into my heart as neatly as it had been tucked into that Bible. But once suspicion is born, it grows. I found myself studying James the way one studies a stranger: his pauses, his silences, even the way he smoothed the sleeve of his shirt. And in those silences, I heard an absence, a piece of him that had never belonged to me. One August evening, as the sky glowed orange behind the rooftops, I sat alone on the porch. The note replayed in my mind: "She must never know." The words beat like a second heart inside me. My gaze drifted to James, who was returning from yet another business trip. His shoulders stooped, his eyes rimmed with red. He smiled faintly when he saw me, but it was a smile that seemed borrowed, fragile, like glass about to shatter. I returned the smile, concealing the storm inside me. For now, I would keep his secret folded in silence. But one question refused to leave me. Who was the woman hidden behind those 7 words? And in that question, a shadow lengthened over our home. Sleep became a stranger to me. Nights stretched long and hollow, the ticking of the clock on the bedroom wall louder than any lullaby. I would lie awake beside James, staring into the dark, listening to the steady rhythm of his breath, wondering what truths lived in the silence between us. My body grew thin from restless nights, and even my children began to notice. Susan would brush my arm at the breakfast table and whisper, "Mama, you hardly eat any more." I would smile, push the eggs around my plate, and assure her everything was fine. But nothing was fine. I searched for evidence in the quiet hours of morning. His shirts, neatly pressed, held no trace of perfume or lipstick. His wallet carried only receipts from diners and gas stations, each one ordinary, harmless. His coat pockets yielded nothing but lint and a few crumpled train stubs. The more I looked, the less I found. And yet the emptiness of that search was its own torment. What kind of secret leaves no fingerprints? It was during these days of unravelling that Mrs. Jenkins came into the picture. She lived 3 houses down, a woman in her late 60s with sharp eyes that missed nothing. Her hair was a silver crown wound into a bun, and she favoured floral dresses with cardigans no matter the weather. She had a voice both warm and cutting, a voice that carried the authority of someone who had seen far too much of life to be fooled by appearances. One afternoon, as I hung laundry on the line, Mrs. Jenkins shuffled over with her basket of clothes. Her hands, spotted with age, moved quickly as she pinned up pillowcases that snapped in the summer breeze. She glanced at me, her eyes narrowing ever so slightly. "You look tired, Margaret," she said, her voice low. "A woman doesn't get that look without a reason." I tried to deflect, muttering something about the heat, but she waved her hand as if brushing away a lie. Secrets, she whispered, leaning close enough that I caught the faint scent of lavender soap. Secrets always leave a trace. If you want to know, you have to follow the trail yourself. No one else can do it for you. Her words clung to me like the scent of sun-dried cotton. That night, I turned them over and over in my mind until they settled into a decision. When James announced, casually over dinner, that he would be heading to Cleveland for business the next morning, my heart quickened. I nodded, feigning indifference. But inside I felt something tighten, as though fate had just extended its hand. The following morning, after packing his suitcase with the same deliberate care, James kissed my cheek and left for the bus station. I stood at the window, watching his tall figure move down the street until he disappeared. Then, with a trembling resolve, I sent the children to my sister Ellen's house on the other side of town. Ellen, a sturdy woman with kind eyes, took them in without question, sensing perhaps that I needed space, but not pressing, for details. I wrapped a shawl around my shoulders, though the air was warm, and hurried to the station. The bus was already rumbling to life, its engine coughing clouds of grey exhaust into the clear morning. I bought a ticket and slipped into a seat 3 rows behind James, pulling the brim of my hat low. My hands gripped the edge of my purse as the bus jolted forward, carrying us through rolling farmland and into the heart of the city. The journey stretched on for nearly 2 hours. I studied his profile reflected faintly in the window, the rigid line of his jaw, the way he rested his hands on his knees, fingers tapping against his trousers as though to some unheard rhythm. He never once turned to glance behind him. Cleveland's streets rose up around us, noisy and crowded, filled with the clamour of traffic and the shouts of vendors hawking their goods. When the bus hissed to a stop, James stepped off briskly, suitcase in hand, disappearing into the throng. I followed at a cautious distance, weaving through businessmen in dark suits, mothers tugging children along, and young boys selling newspapers on the corner. James hailed a taxi. My heart raced as he placed his suitcase in the trunk and slid into the back seat. I quickly caught another cab, my voice barely steady as I told the driver to follow. The city unfolded in a blur of storefronts, bridges, and old brick buildings as we drove deeper into neighborhoods I had never seen. At last, James's cab pulled up in front of a tall, grey structure. Its windows were narrow, its facade weathered by decades of harsh winters. An iron gate stood at its entrance, and above the door hung a sign that made my breath falter: St. Mary's Sanatorium. I leaned forward, clutching the edge of the seat, as though the words themselves had weight enough to crush me. The cab idled at the corner, and I watched as James stepped out, squared his shoulders, and carried his suitcase through those gates without hesitation. The driver asked if I wanted to continue, but I shook my head. My eyes were fixed on the building, on the heavy doors that had swallowed my husband whole. Sanatorium. The word echoed in my chest, cold and unfamiliar. I sat frozen in the back of that cab, unable to move, my heart pounding as if it knew that whatever waited behind those walls would change everything I thought I knew about my life. The corridors of the sanatorium seemed to stretch endlessly, each one lined with pale walls that bore the dull scars of age. The overhead fluorescent lights hummed faintly, flickering every so often as though weary of their own duty. The air was thick with the sterile bite of antiseptic, but beneath it lingered another odour, something older and more sorrowful, like damp paper and fading roses left too long in a vase. Every step I took along that corridor echoed louder than I wanted. as if the building itself were listening. James walked ahead of me with a doctor at his side, their voices muted but steady. The doctor was a tall man, perhaps in his late 50s, his thinning hair combed neatly to the side, a clipboard tucked under one arm. His white coat swayed slightly as he walked, and from the calm authority in his posture, I could sense he had long grown used to guiding families through corridors like these. James matched his pace, his shoulders hunched forward, his head inclined in the manner of a man carrying more than numbers and ledgers in his mind. I trailed at a careful distance, my steps slowed by the weight of dread. Each door they passed bore a black number printed on metal plates that had dulled with time. 21, 22, 23. Each door seemed less like an entrance and more like a sealed chapter of someone else's sorrow. I wondered briefly what lives were unfolding behind those heavy doors. Murmurs of patients lost in their own minds, the sobbing of a mother who no longer knew her child, the ramblings of men forgotten by their families. I shivered, though the air was warm. At last, they stopped in front of a door marked 27. The paint around its frame was chipped, the handle worn from years of turning hands. A dim light from the hallway reflected faintly on the frosted glass inset, which blurred any view of what lay beyond. The doctor drew a key from his pocket, turning it with quiet care, as though opening not just a room, but a vault. James stepped in first, and as the door swung open, I pressed myself against the wall, hidden in the shadow of a flickering light. The angle allowed me a narrow view through the frosted pane. What I saw froze me to the floor. A woman sat on the narrow bed, her back straight yet fragile, as though a strong wind might break her in two. Her hair, long and silver, was braided down her back in a style that spoke of another time, when she may have once been young and admired. Her gown was plain, pale blue against skin that seemed almost translucent. Her face carried no expression. Her eyes, vacant, distant, unfocused, stared into a space far beyond the room, as if she were listening to voices only she could hear. And then, James knelt before her. He placed a small book gently on his lap, its cover worn, its spine cracked with years of handling. Even from where I stood, I recognized it. The Little Prince. It was a book we had read aloud to our children when they were small. Its simple words, carrying lessons too deep for their years. His lips moved softly, shaping the familiar lines. His voice, though muffled by the door, was tender, filled with the same patience he once used when soothing our daughter after a nightmare. In his other hand, he held a bouquet of violets, their colour vivid against the pale gown of the woman. The blossoms trembled slightly as he laid them across her lap. For a moment, his hand lingered on hers, though her own fingers did not respond. It was as if he were clinging to the flowers as much as to her. A storm rose inside me. The man I had shared my life with, the father of my children, was here on his knees, reading to another woman with a devotion I had never seen. The hallway blurred as I struggled to breathe. The sterile scent burned my nose. The buzzing of the lights pressed into my ears. I steadied myself against the wall, my hand trembling against the plaster. "Are you all right, dear?" The voice startled me. I turned to find a nurse standing quietly at my side, as though she had been there all along. She was a woman in her 50s, her figure sturdy, her hair tucked neatly under a white cap. Her eyes were kind but weary, the eyes of someone who had borne witness to years of suffering without turning away. She carried no clipboard, no pen, only the calm presence of experience. I stammered something, though no words made sense. My gaze kept flicking back to the door, back to James kneeling beside that woman. The nurse followed my eyes, and then she nodded slowly, her lips pursed with a compassion that felt almost unbearable. "That's Helen," she said softly. "She's been here nearly 20 years. The name struck me like thunder. "She lost her baby," the nurse continued, her voice low, steady, practiced in the way of those who have told difficult truths too many times. "It was a hard delivery. The child didn't survive. After that, her mind never returned. She drifts, sometimes sits quietly, sometimes cries for hours. He—" She tilted her head toward the door. "He comes every month, without fail, reads to her, brings flowers. Never once has he missed." The walls closed in around me. Helen. The name repeated in my mind like the toll of a church bell. James had told me she was dead. He had told me those years of his past were buried in the ground. He had built a life with me on the ashes of that claim. But she was not gone. She was here, breathing in a room heavy with sorrow, her eyes fixed on nothing, her hair silvered with the years he had hidden her. The nurse's hand touched my arm gently, steadying me as the world threatened to tilt beneath my feet. Her touch was kind, but her words were merciless. "He never forgot her," she said simply, "even when the rest of the world did." I could not respond. My throat was tight, my chest hollow. Behind the frosted pane, I saw James lean closer, his lips moving tenderly over the lines of the book. His hand brushed the bouquet of violets, adjusting it carefully, as though its arrangement might bring her peace. I pressed my palm against the wall, the truth crushing me with a weight I could hardly bear. Helen, the first wife, the ghost he had buried not in death, but in lies. And in that moment, all I could think was this: the man who shared my bed, my table, my children's laughter, was kneeling in devotion before a woman he once told me no longer existed. I ran, out of the sanatorium, past the iron gates that seemed to clang shut like a final judgment, and down the crowded streets of Cleveland. The city swirled around me, horns blaring, vendors shouting, the clang of a trolley bell. But none of it reached me. My chest heaved, as though the very air had turned to stone. The truth I had seen behind that door, the truth I had never asked for, clung to me like a shroud. By the time I boarded the late bus back toward our small Ohio town, the sun had dipped low, staining the horizon a bruised purple. I sat rigid by the window, my hands clasped so tightly in my lap that the knuckles turned white. The road hummed beneath the wheels, and the fields blurred by in long, dark stretches, but inside me everything was jagged, raw, unsteady. I thought of my children, Michael and Susan, waiting at Ellen's house, innocent, unknowing. How could I carry such a secret home to them? When I reached our yellow house with the white shutters, the porch light glowed softly, welcoming as always, but it felt like a cruel imitation of safety. I pushed open the door, walked inside, and the silence pressed in. Every piece of furniture seemed to stare back at me. The framed photographs on the mantel, the worn Bible on the shelf, the rocking chair by the window. This was the home we had built together, and yet it had been built on a lie. Hours passed. I sat in the parlor, a lamp casting a pool of light across the rug, waiting. The children stayed with Ellen that night, sparing them from the storm that was coming. My heart pounded with each passing car, each creak of the floorboards. And then, at last, I heard the familiar sound of James's key turning in the lock. He stepped into the house with weary shoulders, the faint smell of train smoke clinging to his coat. He looked at me sitting there, my face pale in the lamplight, and something in his expression shifted. He knew. He knew before I said a word. "Margaret," he began softly, setting down his suitcase. I I raised my hand, silencing him. "No more lies, James. Not one more." He froze, his jaw working, his eyes darting toward the floor. For a long moment, the only sound in the room was the ticking of the clock on the mantel. Then, as though the weight of his own silence became too much to bear, he sank to his knees before me. Tears came suddenly, violently. They coursed down his face as he buried his hands in his hair. "I can't carry it any more," he choked. "I thought I could, but I can't." I had never seen him cry like that. James Dawson, the man who had stood tall through layoffs at the factory, through our lean years when we barely made rent, through the births of our children. Now he was undone, trembling at my feet. "I loved her," he began, his voice breaking. "Helen. She was my whole world once. When our baby died, something inside her shattered. She stopped eating, stopped speaking, and the doctors said there was nothing to be done but to place her in St. Mary's. I visited, month after month, year after year, hoping she might come back to me. But she never did." He paused, gasping as though the memories themselves suffocated him. His tears dripped onto the carpet, darkening it in small circles. "I should have told you," he whispered. "I should have told you before I ever put a ring on your finger. But I was afraid, Margaret. Afraid you'd walk away. Afraid you'd see me not as a man, but as a husband already spoken for by tragedy. So I lied. I told you she was gone, buried in the past, so I could have a chance at a life with you." His words cut deeper than any blade could. I sat frozen, my chest hollow, my hands gripping the arm of the chair until the wood bit into my palms. Everything he confessed only confirmed what I had already seen with my own eyes. The violets, the book, the tenderness, and beneath it all, the lie that had stretched across 15 years of my marriage. "Do you have any idea what you've done to me?" I whispered, my voice trembling with rage and grief. He lifted his face, streaked with tears, his eyes pleading. "I know. I know I've destroyed the trust between us. But Margaret, you must believe. What I feel for you is real. What we've built, our children, our life together. It's real. I was just too much of a coward to bring my shadows into your light." I could not bear another word. I rose to my feet, shaking, and declared, "I won't raise my children in a house built on lies." The next morning, I packed what I could. Dresses folded into a suitcase, the children's clothes tucked into bags, photographs slipped carefully from their frames. James tried to stop me, his voice hoarse from a sleepless night of begging, but I would not bend. With Michael on one side and Susan on the other, I walked out that door and returned to the safety of my parents' farmhouse. The weeks that followed were heavy with silence. James sent letters, long, aching confessions written in his careful script. He recounted memories of Helen, of the baby they had lost, of the years he had spent walking the lonely halls of St. Mary's. He spoke of his shame, of the fear that had kept him from honesty, of the love he swore he still carried for me. Every day the postman brought another envelope, and every day I opened it with trembling hands, torn between fury and pity. In the stillness of my parents' home, I read his words by lamplight, my children sleeping in the room across the hall. Sometimes his letters made me weep. Sometimes they made me burn with anger. I did not answer them. I did not know how. My heart was too raw, my mind too clouded with betrayal. And then, one autumn morning, as the air turned crisp and the leaves scattered in golden drifts across the yard, a telegram arrived. Its envelope was thin, its contents brief. My hands shook as I unfolded the slip of paper, the ink stark against the page. Helen Dawson has passed away. The words blurred before my eyes, but their meaning struck clear and merciless. The ghost that had haunted my marriage, the woman hidden behind years of silence and deception, was gone at last. The November sky hung low, grey and damp, the kind of sky that pressed sorrow into your bones. After Helen's burial, a quiet, heavy rain had settled over our small town, streaking the windows and dripping from the eaves. The ground was still fresh at the cemetery, a raw wound of earth where her name had been carved into stone. It was only days later that word came. James had fallen ill. Pneumonia, the doctor said. He had been found at his desk, fever burning, his breath rattled and shallow. By the time they admitted him into the county hospital, he was pale and shaking, a man worn thin by grief and secrets. The hospital stood at the edge of town, a 3-story brick building with white-trimmed windows and the constant hum of activity within. Nurses in starched uniforms moved briskly through the halls, their shoes clicking softly against linoleum floors. The faint scent of antiseptic hung in the air, mingled with the sharper tang of rubbing alcohol and the distant whiff of coffee from the break room. I hesitated at the door to his room. For years, I had stood on the other side of thresholds, kitchens, bedrooms, parlours, believing I knew what waited inside. Now, I no longer trusted doors. James lay propped against white pillows, his face drawn, his chest rising with effort. The once strong frame of a man who had built ledgers, carried burdens, and tilled soil beside me was reduced to a trembling shell. His hair clung damp to his forehead, and a thin sheen of sweat glistened at his temple. When his eyes opened and found mine, they filled instantly with tears. "Margaret," he rasped, his voice raw from fever. "You came." I moved closer, the chair creaking softly beneath me as I sat. I studied him. The pale lips, the trembling hands, the weakness that had replaced the steady presence I had once leaned upon. And in that fragile moment, I felt both the sting of betrayal and the tug of something older, something deeper. "I had to," I said quietly. The silence between us stretched, filled only by the steady tick of the clock on the wall and the muffled sounds of gurneys wheeling down the corridor. At last, he lifted a trembling hand, reaching toward me. "I lied because I was afraid," he whispered. "Not because I wanted to hurt you. 15 years, Margaret. 15 years of pretending I was whole when I was torn in two. I lived between two worlds, the life I lost with Helen and the life I built with you. Every day I thought the truth would drive you away, and I could not bear that." His voice broke, and the tears came, spilling down into the rough stubble that had grown across his jaw. "You were my chance at light again, and I buried my darkness so deep I thought it would never surface. But secrets don't stay buried. They find their way back." I closed my eyes, the words piercing me as sharply as the cold November air outside. For the first time, I realized how much fear had guided his every step. Not malice, not contempt, but fear. And fear had poisoned us both. We talked that night as we had never talked before. Stripped bare of pretense, of pride, of the walls we had built, we spoke of grief and guilt, of children and trust, of the fragile threads that bound us together even as lies had torn us apart. His voice shook, his body trembled, but his words carried an honesty I had never heard from him until that moment. "I don't want to lose you, Margaret," he said finally, clutching my hand as though it were the last anchor keeping him on this earth. "Not now. Not ever. Give me a chance to make this right." The lamp by his bed cast a soft golden glow, and in it I studied his face. The deep lines carved by sorrow, the pale blue eyes rimmed with fever, the mouth that trembled with truth at last. He was not the man I had believed him to be, but he was also not a stranger. "If there is to be another chance," I said slowly, my voice steady, though my heart quaked, "then it cannot be built on shadows. I will not live in half-truths." He swallowed hard, nodding. "From this day on," I continued, "you must be completely honest with me. About everything. No more lies, no more secrets. Our children deserve a home of truth." His hand tightened around mine. "Yes," he whispered. "And there is more," I said, my voice firmer now. "The house will be in my name, not because I want power, but because I must protect Michael and Susan. They cannot lose both security and trust." Tears welled again in his eyes, but he nodded. "And one more thing," I added. "We will seek help, together. Counseling in Cleveland. We cannot mend this alone." The words hung in the room, heavy yet strangely freeing. For the first time in months, my shoulders eased, the tight band around my chest loosened. These were not demands born of vengeance. They were conditions for survival, for rebuilding something broken beyond easy repair. James's face crumpled, and the sob that escaped him was unlike any I had ever heard. He pressed my hand against his lips, trembling. "Yes, Margaret. Yes to all of it. Whatever it takes. I'll do it. Just don't walk away." I watched him, his frail body shaking with the force of his tears, and for the first time in a long while, I believed that he meant every word. The fever might have weakened his body, but honesty had stripped his soul bare. In that sterile hospital room, with the hum of machines and the whisper of nurses outside, we found ourselves standing at the edge of something both terrifying and tender, the possibility of beginning again. James lifted his eyes, wet with tears, and nodded once more, slowly, deliberately. Whether that nod could carry us through the storms ahead, I did not yet know. The first morning James returned home from the hospital, the house felt unfamiliar, as though the walls themselves were waiting to see what we would do next. I opened the front door, and the children stepped inside ahead of him, their voices rising with nervous laughter as they carried their bags up the stairs. James followed slowly, still weakened from fever, leaning slightly on the railing, pausing to catch his breath. I watched him cross the threshold of our yellow house with the white shutters, the home we had both built and nearly lost. And as I stood there on the porch, the crisp air filling my lungs, I understood something simple, but undeniable. Rebuilding was not a single act. It would be 1,000 small choices, repeated day after day. So we began. At first it was awkward, the silence between us heavy with all the words we had yet to say. But little by little those silences softened. We kept the promise we had made in the hospital. On the first Saturday morning after his return, James and I boarded the bus together to Cleveland. We sat in the waiting room of a counseling office, the carpet worn thin, the smell of old coffee lingering in the air. For the first time in years, we let another person sit between us and guide our voices. Those sessions were not easy. There were tears, sharp words, long pauses where neither of us knew how to go on. But there were also moments of recognition, when James spoke a truth I had always suspected, when I admitted how deeply the lies had scarred me, when both of us understood that beneath the ruins, something worth saving still lived. The greatest test came when we visited Helen's grave together. It was spring then, the air soft with the scent of lilacs, the grass green and damp beneath our shoes. The headstone was simple, her name carved into granite that caught the sunlight in quiet dignity. James stood still for a long time, his hands clasped before him, his lips moving silently in prayer. I stayed a step behind at first, uncertain if I belonged in this private circle of grief. But then, as he turned toward me, his eyes red but steady, I stepped forward. We knelt together, side by side, and I whispered a prayer not just for Helen, but for the strength to forgive the years that had brought us here. Life did not transform overnight, but slowly, rhythm returned. Michael, our eldest, grew into a serious young man with a mind for science. He spent long evenings bent over his books, talking with his grandfather about chemistry and medicine, and in time chose to study pharmacy, just as my father had done before him. Susan, with her notebooks and quiet sighs, blossomed into a young woman who carried her own kind of gentleness. She trained as a teacher, her eyes always lit with patience, her voice calm in a way that reminded me, sometimes achingly, of Helen's softness. Years folded one into another, their edges softened by the steady routines of family life. James and I learned the language of truth. We argued, yes, but never again with the weight of secrets pressing between us. He told me where he went, what he feared, what he longed for, and in return, I found myself opening in ways I never had before, sharing my doubts, my weariness, even my hopes for the children's futures. By the time our 40th wedding anniversary arrived, our home was once again filled with laughter. The children had families of their own. The yard was crowded with grandchildren running between the maple trees, and the dining table was heavy with dishes passed from hand to hand. That evening, beneath the soft glow of the porch light, James took my hand and looked at me as though we were once again standing at an altar. "Margaret," he said quietly, his voice trembling with age, 40 years ago, I made a vow and broke it with silence. Tonight, I make it again, with nothing hidden. There were no guests, no minister, no ceremony but our own. Yet in that moment, with his hand warm against mine, the vow was stronger than any we had spoken in our youth. The decades passed gently after that. Seasons came and went, bringing the hum of cicadas in summer, the crunch of leaves in autumn, the hush of snow in winter. We grew old together, our hair turning silver, our bodies slowing, but our days marked by the quiet comfort of honesty. We carried the scars of our story, but those scars became part of the bond itself, proof that we had endured and chosen each other still. In the winter of 1998, the cold was sharp, the snow piled high against the windows. James had grown frail, his steps shortened, his breath shallow. One evening, as the house lay quiet around us, he lay back against the pillows, his hand resting in mine. His eyes, pale blue and gentle, found mine with a depth that still startled me after so many years. "Margaret," he whispered, "thank you for staying." I leaned close, pressing his hand to my cheek. "We stayed," I answered softly, "together." And there, in the hush of our bedroom, With the snow drifting outside and the mantel clock ticking gently, James breathed his last in my arms. His face grew still, peaceful. The lines of sorrow softened into something like grace. I sat with him long into the night, my hand still holding his, until the stars themselves seemed to dim. Now, when I look back across the long road of our life, I see not perfection, but persistence. Ours was a love tested by lies, scarred by grief, nearly broken by silence. Yet it was also a love rebuilt, carried through decades by the stubborn strength of forgiveness. Love is not flawless. It is not easy. But it is the choice we make, again and again, to see one another fully, to forgive, to begin anew. That choice carried James and me through 30 more years together. And that choice is the legacy I leave to my children, to my grandchildren, to anyone who listens to this old woman's story. As we close this story, I invite you to sit for a moment with its weight, not the details, but the feeling it leaves behind, the reminder that even in the most fragile corners of our lives, there can be room for mending, for choosing one another again. Time has a way of softening sharp edges. What once felt impossible to forgive can, with patience, turn into something that makes us stronger, more tender, more human. None of us walks through this life without mistakes, without shadows. Yet sometimes, the very act of staying, of holding on, becomes its own quiet kind of courage. Perhaps you will carry from this tale a gentle thought that love, in its truest form, is less about perfection and more about endurance, about the way two hearts can stumble, fall, and still find a way to rise together. Thank you for listening, dear friends. If this story touched your heart, I would be grateful if you leave a kind comment, subscribe, or simply share it with someone who might need it. Until we meet again, may your days be gentle, your nights be peaceful, and may your heart always find the strength to forgive.